A lot of policing is merely showing up to bear witness to the horror that's already occurred. Service without boundaries is unsustainable. When one is wired for contribution and wired for service, if they are not equally wired for growth, then the service eventually becomes unsustainable. Feels like there's not a lot of good male role models out there right now.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to Time with Tim. I'm Andy Carlson, joined by Tim Fletcher, and today we're sitting down with Hal Hughes. Hal is a retired police officer, former MMA fighter, and now a registered psychotherapist. His journey includes multiple traumatic brain injuries, years of depression and addiction, and a powerful recovery that's reshaped how he helps others heal today. He's 9 years sober, a father, husband, counselor, and living proof that even when the brain is injured and the spirit is broken, the human heart can find the courage and capacity to rebuild. Hal, we're really grateful to have you here today.
Thanks so much for having me.
And we really love to start with your story so we can get to know the full individual. And so could you take us back to your early years and begin with your childhood and share what your life has been like?
Sure. And thanks so much for that introduction. When you put it in such a way, I was like, wow, whoever you're talking about sounds awesome. Oh wait, that's me. Oh my gosh. Thanks again. So my early childhood, so I grew up in Eastern Ontario, just a little bit west of Ottawa, but an hour west of Ottawa, kind of near a village called Merrickville. Near the closest town would have been Smiths Falls, small town, 10,000 people. Um, I think I would probably be remiss if I didn't say that my story really started with my parents' story, and it's a love story. Um, I grew up in a log house my dad built, and that log house was situated between the two farms that both of my parents grew up on. So my mom grew up on one farm with her parents, and my dad in the other. And they went to school together in a one-room schoolhouse that was between those two farms. That was back in the 50s when they literally had to take turns bringing in wood for the wood stove to keep the room warm. And my mom and dad tell stories about when they were like 7 and 9 years old having crushes on each other. And so, my story started with their story. They've been together since they were kids, quite literally, grew up together, got married young, had my brother and I. And so that was the sort of foundation of what I came into. My parents, who are now 81 and 79, are still together today. And growing up with them was pretty idyllic, really. My mom stayed at home as a stay-at-home mom to take care of the house, take care of us. And my dad went to work as a school teacher. He was a mathematician. So he taught at high school for 35 years. And, my memories of childhood are sort of to best encapsulated. It was, I'd come home from school, my mom would have dinner. We'd always have dinner together as a family. And then after dinner, I was outside to play sports with my dad and my brother. Um, my mom, I think, in reflecting back with how I ended up in service to others in terms of as a police officer and now what I do as a psychotherapist, I learned that from my mom. I got the love of loving others and serving others from my mother. And I got the desire to learn, grow, and be curious, I would say, from my dad. One of my earlier memories, or at least in my early, 10, 12 years of age, was my dad had a bookshelf. And I can remember as a little kid, like looking through these books. And when I was maybe 11 or 12, my dad pulled one of them off and gave it to me and said, "This would be a good start for you." And believe it or not, that book was Your Erroneous Zones. As you probably both know, that book by Wayne Dyer, phenomenal teacher and writer. And that was one of the first books I can remember reading around psychology and self-help. And really my journey that led me to psychotherapy, it kind of started back then. Um, my dad gently encouraged me to always be learning, always be curious, and always kind of trying to grow um, sort of mentally and emotionally. Um, and so, yeah, so I mean, I had that kind of an upbringing. My teen years went well, did really well in school. Was identified fairly early on in public school as being gifted, which back then I didn't even really know what it meant, other than we had to do some testing, my cousin and I, who I went to school with, and I got this label of being, I think they called it gifted back then. And what all that meant to me was once every couple weeks, I got to get out of their ordinary class and go do some interesting things in the library with I think it would have been like a spec ed teacher back then. And I think part of the testing came about my cousin and I were getting into the odd little bit of trouble because we were kind of bored. We tasks that would take other kids 10 minutes would take us, a minute or something. So got identified as gifted and got put into that program. In my teen years, so school was always easy. Didn't have to put a ton of work into it and was able to get good grades, but wanted to spend most of my time doing sports, other athletics, started lifting weights and running early on too, which has sort of maintained a big part of my life. So my teen and early childhood was idyllic. I really, in doing my own work as a therapist, my own personal work, I've reflected a lot of my childhood. And when people ask me about it, I would have to really think long and hard to come up with anything resembling sort of anything traumatic or even negative. I'm so lucky. And in reflecting on what I've been through as an adult, I really feel like my parents provided, just choke myself up. Sorry. Um, sorry, that's gratitude right there. They provided a foundation for me and an anchoring and roots, if you will, that I think maybe the only thing that allowed me to survive what I went through as an adult. So then, and, when I got through my teen years, I decided to go away to university, went to Waterloo in kinesiology, thought maybe I was going to do maybe medicine, chiropractic, something like that. I realized that being gifted and having a high intelligence had very little to do with success in academics. You also had to put the work in, which I was not prepared or ready to do at that point. So I did a year, dropped out of university, started traveling the world, hitchhiked across Canada, went to New Zealand and Australia, again, in alignment with wanting to learn, being curious, wanting to grow. And I've always been kind of an explorer. I did that. Then I went back to school for a year, shifted over to Carleton. After a year of traveling, what that looked like was major in philosophy, which was consistent with sort of trying to find myself and my place in the world. Uh, and during those early years of university, probably the most pivotal thing that happened to me was I met my wife. So I had been bartending to put myself through school, and I was a bartender at this nightclub, and she walked in as a I guess back then it would have been called kind of a waitress or cocktail waitress, and it sounds so cliche, the love at first sight thing. Definitely lust at first sight at a minimum, and it turned into love. But I think 2 weeks later, we were living together, basically, and we've been together ever since. We have 4 kids, 2 grandkids, and I get choked up when I talk about my parents. When I talk about my wife, I really get choked up because, um, again, if my parents gave me the roots that allowed me to weather the storm in my adult life, my wife has been the trunk of the tree and the foundation and stuck by me when she probably shouldn't have, but she would have a lot of excuses or reasons to not stick by me, but she did. Um, so again, I'm choked up with gratitude. I've been a very lucky man, which when you hear the rest of my story, you may not look at it that way, but I consider myself very lucky. So went through my university years. It was kind of a year on, a year off. I did distance education at one point when I was bartending in Toronto. And back then, distance education was getting mailed VHS tapes. And sort of finally got my degree done. And I really only got it done because I finally decided in my late 20s, you know what, I think I need a quote unquote real job. Not that there's anything wrong with bartending, but getting people intoxicated isn't the most fulfilling work. And so I finished my degree. My cousin was a cop at the time, and I thought, okay, maybe policing would be good. Again, it'd be in alignment with my desire to serve others that I learned from my mom, and it'd be a little bit exciting. I was kind of always someone who liked adrenaline type things. In one of my breaks from university, I took a 3-month mountaineering course out of Canmore, Alberta, and did rock, ice, all kinds of different climbing during that time too. I've done a lot of different things like skydiving and different things like that. So I thought policing would give me a little bit of that excitement and the service component. So what I did initially was I got hired into federal corrections, which I knew I was using kind of as a stepping stone to my ultimate goal, which was law enforcement in policing. So I did a short amount of time at Joyceville Penitentiary in the federal correctional system in Canada. and then eventually got hired on to Perth Police, which no longer exists. It's been taken over by the OPP since 2013. And so that's kind of like a Cole's Notes childhood to how my career and um, the trauma parts of my story start.
It's just fascinating listening to you because there's so many similarities um, to my own story. So again, I work in a world where people grew up with a lot of very dysfunctional families, and when they hear kind of what my family of origin was like and how healthy it was like, well, then why are what gives you the right to talk to us? And
Yeah.
it's and so my mom was stay at home, um, sports with dad, all of that evening stuff, and just wonderful, many wonderful things there. Wife that's been fantastic through all of my journey and the ups and downs of it. Um, was considered a gifted child, but never had to study in my life, and then failed my first two courses in university and
Yeah.
realized, different ball game here, and had to kind of learn how to study and work hard. But and I grew up on farms and all of that working. So I think part of my journey has been there was absolutely nothing in my childhood that would be considered traumatic, but yet I knew there's no perfect home, that everybody is affected. And so part of my journey has been looking for some of the subtle things that maybe didn't meet my needs perfectly the way I wanted them or needed them met, or weren't as healthy as they should have been. And so just and you can respond to this, but just a couple examples from my own thing that I've figured out was my mom and dad both coming up, um, born just before World War II, and then the end of the Depression and going through that work ethic where you got to work hard in order to survive. That got passed on to us. And so we learned how to work like a dog. But if you ever relaxed and tried to take care of yourself, then you were being lazy or you were being selfish. And so I had to really look at that and go, that actually set me up to burn out later.
Yes.
They meant well, taught me wonderful things, but yet it had a downside that I needed to face. And then my mom and dad were both involved in church stuff. And so loving others, giving, making sacrifices, always there for people, never saying no, give was really almost idolized as the way to be. But having good boundaries wasn't part of that. And so self-sacrifice, sacrificing for others was out of balance from actually taking care of yourself. And that set me up to later struggle. So I love my parents and they've been the rock that kind of built my life on. But I think part of the journey was those very subtle things, given my personality, set me up to actually, when certain situations came along in adult life, I used the wrong set of tools and then struggled because of that. So any comments that you would have that you've seen from your upbringing?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks for sharing that. And the number of parallels or the commonality between your story and mine, it's really interesting. What I would say is, as you're speaking about the, boundaries and service, something I've had to learn as well is the idea that service um, without boundaries is unsustainable.
Exactly.
And similarly, when one is wired for contribution and wired for service, if they are not equally wired for growth, then the service eventually becomes unsustainable. And so my mother, in her passing on the desire to love and serve others, um, I think at times there's a lot of self-sacrifice on her part. And I can see that now clearly and go, okay, that's part of what led to sort of my injuries, not the physical ones, but the psychological ones. In that I was, as we get older, our level of responsibility, and if we're wired for service, our level of service and our burdens and obligation gets more and more. It doesn't become less, as we know, right? And so that's great, and that's a great way to be fulfilled as a person. But if you take your eye off the growth piece,
Exactly.
eventually you end up burnout and injured. And so now what I've had to adapt in my life is keeping an eye on the growth and the contribution. And so I've built a life and basically a series of daily habits and rituals that is rooted in um, consistent and persistent growth, um, not just psychologically and emotionally, but perhaps most focus on physical health. So as I, even in my own practice, have experienced wanting to serve more and more clients, and I do 35, 40 a week, which is quite a bit. I have simultaneously increased my physical endurance through ultra marathons and other things that I do. And so I have a steady eye on who the most important person in my life is and take really, really good care of him so that he can continue to serve others.
Exactly. Yeah. What I realized was my trauma, the traumatic events came as an adult, but some of the subtle deficits that came out of my childhood affected how I coped with those traumatic events. And I suffered because of that. And so it's not to blame my parents at all. It's just to really understand it's not the total link or the only link to explain my adult stuff, but there is an element there that I have to be willing to look at.
Yeah.
And just for my own growth, so that I learn how to take care of myself and I learn how to keep growing, and not using some of those old tools that really aren't adequate for some of the adult stuff. So take us into, like, to me, listening to your story, there's the secondary trauma of being in kind of police work, corrections work, etc. There's the brain injury stuff. Then there's addiction stuff. So you got three things that are all powerful negative impact things that you had to go through. So walk people through some of that if you don't mind.
Yeah, I'll start kind of the beginning of that sort of chapter in my life. Maybe I'll share just one incident from policing. It was in 2007 when I started to realize that the career was taking a toll. And I had made the connection with this specific incident and incidents like it and my childhood and why I was particularly vulnerable to this type of an incident. And so basically, for this particular incident, we got called to a situation where someone had gone underwater. They were out paddling, but they had quickly sort of floated up from where they were trapped. Someone had dragged them to shore and kind of immediately started CPR. And by coincidence, I happened to be about 20 seconds away in my cruiser. And we had just recently had defibrillator devices. We've been trained on to put them in my car. And so I was on scene from the time this person's accident happened within like a minute. It was the stars were lining up where I'm not sure if you're aware, but when you're giving somebody CPR, the chance of getting them back is it's not good. It's really there's a low expectation of. But this was one of those scenarios where I was like, this is going to be the one, that I get back. So get on the scene. And another coincidence, the person who was able to get them out of the water had been trained on CPR as well. Again, another sort of good luck thing happening in the scenario. Did CPR for a long time. The ambulance was a little bit out, so I gave CPR for quite a while. Ambulance got there. I jumped in the back of the ambulance with the patient and helped the paramedics. I didn't stop giving compressions from the moment I got to that person until the ER docs like basically shoved me off and said, "We got it." So I went into the sort of the other area of the ER, and I was thinking, like, we got this one. Like, this is going to be a save. And a lot of policing is merely showing up to bear witness to the horror that's already occurred. And you get into it to make a difference, but you quickly realize no matter what you do, a lot of times the outcome is out of your control, which can lead to learned helplessness, which maybe we can have further conversation with about that. So I'm waiting. Eventually, half hour later, ER doc comes out. She's died. We're super busy. Can you get a hold of the family and do the death notifications? Little room off to the side of the ER where you do that. The woman's spouse comes in. I tell him what's happened. He hits the floor, and you've probably bared witness to what that sound and looks like, that level of grief, tragedy. He's on the floor. A few minutes later, their two adult children show up. I have to tell them because he can't speak. And then a while after that, the elderly parent to this person shows up, and I have to tell him. So they're in a heap on the floor, in abject grief, screaming, and I'm all alone dealing with this, and there's nothing I can do. And so after that incident, like it's like I felt something shift, but I was sort of able to keep things going at work and at home. At this point, I had 3 kids, and another one was on the way at this point. And then I was in my police cruiser. This was a few months later on January 2nd, 2008. And I was stopped waiting to turn following somebody going to do a traffic stop. And the sun was setting right in front of us on that highway. And the guy behind me was kind of blinded by the sun, didn't see me stopped in the middle of the highway, and hit the back of my cruiser uh, fast enough and hard enough to total it. And my head took the total impact of that off the steering wheel. And so that was the first, what was classified as mild traumatic brain injury. Again, I don't know where they come up with those terms, but it wasn't mild. It's like a mild divorce, I guess. And I was off work for about 20 months altogether from that brain injury, and was also diagnosed with PTSD at that time.
So again, just parallel connections from my own life. So another subtle little thing from my childhood is my great-grandparents came from Britain. So we kind of have that very stoic British emotional reserve where you can show emotions a little bit, but not too much. And you got to kind of stuff everything else down. And so I didn't really realize that as an issue. I just thought we were kind of a calm family that didn't show a lot of emotion until I got into pastoral work and then had to deal with death and all kinds of traumatic stuff. And like you, I realized it was taking a toll, but I didn't know why, or I didn't know what to do about it. And part of it was, well, I wasn't allowed to express emotions totally. You just had to repress. You had to hold it down and kind of be there for others and keep your shit together kind of stuff. And that was really much part of it. And there was also almost an element too where there's a lot of my emotional world that had been repressed so long that I wasn't even aware of it. It was subconscious happening, and it was taking a toll and adding stress, but I wasn't even aware that that was happening. Anyways, where I'm going with this is, like, I think to me, one of the growing important understandings around trauma has been secondary trauma. And that is when you, as a counselor or first responder or policeman, are in traumatic events that are happening to others. So it's not directly happening to you, but you're still carrying the toll of the stress of that situation that you're helpless to do anything about. That can take the toll. So the burnout typically is 2 to 3 years for most people if they don't learn to care for themselves. But like I'm just highlighting what I think to me is a significant piece of your story is that from your time in corrections as kind of a screw or a guard in jail, and in that environment, then a police officer, you're in this very negative, dangerous, traumatic environment daily that's reaping havoc within your kind of nervous system that you're not even aware of until it hits a breaking point. And then the head injury comes along,
Yeah.
and that just adds straw that breaks the camel's back almost to things. Then it just starts breaking down quickly, and it's like, I don't know where to go from here. I don't know what to do,
Yeah.
etc.
Yeah. And so I'll uh, sort of spring off from your last comment, which is you said like you get to that place where I don't know what to do. So what we know in the research around learned helplessness, and there's some of the studies that were done with dogs years ago now, where and maybe for the sake of your audience, some quick explanation, but you take a dog and you put him in an enclosure where and then you put a divider in the middle of the enclosure. So there's two sides to the enclosure, and the dog's able to jump over the barrier to get to the other side. And so what they would do is they would electrify the one side. And so when they turn the current on, not enough to hurt the animal, but just uncomfortable, the animal will quickly learn, okay, if I jump over the barrier or get to the other side, I'm okay. Then what you do is you take the animal, put them in a harness where you turn the current on, they try to jump over, but they can't. No matter what they do, they can't avoid the suffering and the pain. Then what you do is you take the harness off, and the animal won't even try to jump over the barrier. He'll just lay down and kind of sort of moan and cry. He's learned that he's helpless to avoid the pain and suffering, so he stops trying. Now, what's really interesting with those animals, and this is a state that can be induced in humans. I would argue that in law enforcement, and other first responder careers, corrections, et cetera, this is what happens: is um, in the policing world, essentially, you're not in a harness, but you're in a uniform, and the pain and suffering of others that you're bearing witness to, and the danger that you're having to face, is unavoidable, much like the current that's turned on. And so what happens with those animals when they get taken out of that enclosure, something interesting happens. Once that learned helplessness has been induced in them, their ability to solve problems or know what to do or learn new things and material is greatly compromised. So to jump off of your last statement of, you get to this place, I don't know what to do, it's exactly, and it's, I believe in part because learned helplessness has been induced in the first responder. It was induced in me in that I was mostly just showing up to document after the fact things that were painful and awful, like that one incident I described. And so when I went off work with that brain injury and the PTSD diagnosis, you know, in the past, I was a resourceful person able to solve problems in my life and help other people in my life. And suddenly I felt like I didn't know what to do. My ability to learn new things and solve the problem of my own injury was compromised in part, I think, because of the nature of the career.
Yeah, and we teach our clients all the time that, so one way to understand complex trauma or ongoing danger to a child is they can't resolve the problems because mom and dad aren't helping them. Mom and dad are causing the problems. So they are legitimately helpless to resolve the problem. So they basically live with this constant pain that they can't resolve, even though they're trying and trying and trying and getting their hopes up and think, if I try this, then it's going to fix it, but it doesn't work. So they get to a point where they're not only helpless, but then they feel hopeless that I can't resolve this. And so give up. And so that's where people can slide into that victim mentality that I'm a ongoing victim that is helpless to improve my life. So I can complain about everything, but don't ask me to change or fix anything. And so it's a learned helplessness, but it's more of a victim mindset. And so what I want people to realize is, yes, you were legitimately helpless as a child, and that you have to grieve that, and that's terrible. You're not helpless now if you're with safe people, which means now you have to learn agency. And that's going to feel scary because the fear is, if I try to solve something, I'm going to get disappointed again. I'm going to fail again. I'm going to get rejected again. So now you got to walk through all these new fears that are going to come up as soon as you try to become not helpless. And it's a huge growing obstacle for many people early in their recovery from trauma is to learn agency.
Yeah.
They think they want agency, but they don't realize that that victim status for so many years makes them afraid of agency.
Yeah. The way you articulated that, Tim, was just so bang on with my understanding of trauma and the solution, if you will, to overcoming trauma. And again, our backgrounds are very similar, our childhoods and stuff. And I feel like our approach to trauma, healing trauma, is probably very similar too, because when I'm working with clients, it's what I've learned is that if I can help them feel resilient, psychologically, emotionally, physically is important too. If I can help them feel strong and resilient in the moment and develop agency in the moment, I find that independent of any of this specific trauma work about past incidents, independent of that, when they feel strong in the here and now and have agency in the here and now, when they look back at the events of their life, they don't look the same either.
Exactly.
And when
Exactly.
they look to the future with things that may be potentially scary or even the tragedies in the future they'll have to face, because we all do, they don't look the same either.
Exactly.
And it's not necessarily that they're less scared, perhaps, but it's that they've learned to be courageous.
Exactly.
And it's one of those powerful things that you can do with a client when you can see them sort of slowly make that transition from victim to hero of their own story.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, and that courage isn't just the absence of fear, it's walking through fear and doing the right thing in the face of fear. So it's tolerating the fear and not trying to run from it, but yet still choosing to use the right tools in the face of fear. Um, I want to jump to the head injury
Okay.
stuff. So when I first started in the addiction field and the trauma field 22 years ago, it was quite amazing to me how many people um, who were struggling with addiction also had head injury.
Yeah.
And so I looked at a bunch of stuff by Daniel Amen, who does the SPECT imaging of the brain, and began to see kind of that some people with brain injury, their brain looks very similar to somebody with trauma.
Yeah.
And somebody with brain injury looks very similar to somebody struggling with addiction because different parts of the brain aren't functioning properly. And so I think to me, it's so important for people to, with brain injury, to understand it's a significant piece to understand if you're going to begin to do recovery well. But secondly, for some people, some brain injury you can heal, other brain injury is permanent, and it therefore becomes a disability. It becomes something you just have to learn how to manage and navigate around and figure out how it makes you vulnerable in different situations and learn how to plan for all of that and build people into your life that will help you with that. But it's a significant piece of the recovery puzzle for some people. And then if they don't learn how to live and deal with that piece, nothing else happens in their recovery because it just keeps taking them out. So can you speak to kind of the brain injury and how it affected you? The disability element of it that you've had to learn to live with and what that looks like
Sure.
for you?
Yeah. Sure. Thanks, Tim. Yeah. And so the initial that first accident in my cruiser was a mild injury. So you're going to hear later in my story there was a much more severe brain injury. But that initial brain injury, what happened was over the course of a week, these symptoms started kind of cascade down and emerge. And then with some cognitive testing and stuff, we identified that there's memory and attentional deficits. Emotional regulation was a huge issue. I slept 20 hours a day for the first 6, 8 months, I bet you. Again, that's very common with brain injury where you need that extra sleep. Your brain's trying to recover. And what was probably most striking about that first injury was I went from January 1st, 2008, the day before the accident, I was by all accounts, I think anyone look on the outside looking in would say like very resilient. I had a black belt in jujitsu. Consider myself a great, really involved father, husband, son, friend. Was really performing at a high level in my career. That was January 1st. January 2nd, when my head took that impact, I went from that person to within a few months, I became suicidal. And and I suspect can make a little connection here too from the past thing I mentioned about being gifted. Um, it's have you ever heard the story of the metaphor of the knife for the brain? So I'll share it. Maybe your listeners, or maybe you haven't heard this before, but so it's a story of a young man who decides he wants to be a chef. So he gets on Google, tries to find the Gordon Ramsay type in the area, tracks his ass down, goes to the restaurant, begs for a job. Chef says, "All right, kid, I'll take you on, but all you're gonna do is chop vegetables for 6 months." Kid's like, "Yeah, no problem." So the chef brings out this knife and hands it to him very carefully and says, "This is not your mom's kitchen knife. This is a professional, surgical steeled, it's a Henkel, perfectly balanced knife. It's a very sharp instrument. Be careful with it." Kid's like, "Yeah." Kid starts chopping carrots. A few minutes later, the chef pokes his head in. "Remember, it's a very sharp instrument." Kid's like, "Yeah." So guess what happens in the first hour? The kid cuts his finger because in an unsteady, untrained hand, you can do a lot of damage with a sharp instrument. And so for me, looking in retrospect with some of my struggles, is I had a very sharp instrument. I was gifted and a very high processing speed. We found out later on some of these values, um, but because of the brain injury and the PTSD, that sharp instrument was in an unsteady, untrained hand. And so the damage I did to myself and the damage I did to other people with that sharp instrument was a lot. And it was like 1,000 horsepower engine going the wrong way up a one-way street really fast. And I became suicidal within a few months of that injury. Um, I did not make an attempt on my life, but I can remember, intentionally engaging in some pretty risky behaviors and thinking that, I didn't care if I did die. And so, yeah, so the brain injury changed my personality for that period of time. It's like I didn't recognize myself. I gained like 30 pounds. I was overweight, and before that, I was a kind of an elite level athlete. And I was really, I couldn't find the solution. And at the time, I couldn't see the motivation until something happened with my son. At the time, he was just a little guy, and my wife was trying to explain to him why daddy wasn't the same daddy anymore, why I didn't tuck him in at night, why I didn't play with him, why he slept all day. And she just kept saying like this, he's different. He's a different daddy now. And then my little boy, he was 3 or 4 at the time, he looked me in the eye and he said, "Well, I want my real daddy to come home." And you want to talk about motivation from the root motive, reason why. Um, like I woke up because suddenly I got, pulled my head out from my own ass. So it was all turned in on myself. How am I feeling? How are my migraines? How is my mood? How is my, poor me, victim. And my son woke me up and I realized I'm part of a social fabric and I'm doing damage to everyone and everything else by not putting the work into my own recovery. And it was a relatively short period of time from my son saying that to me getting back to full duties, full time as an officer.
Did you struggle with impulse control as part of your brain injury stuff?
Yeah, and you'll hear in the second injury, I made some really interesting decisions. I was also diagnosed with bipolar later on in my story, and
Okay,
so I suspect that, and also the impulse control when the frontal lobes of your brain are damaged.
right.
There was definitely some issues there. Yeah.
Um, Again, I relate when I kind of burnt myself out after 10 years of the toll of pastoring and all of that. And I was diagnosed with chronic fatigue syndrome and lost all motivation, became suicidal. And it was partly because high contributor, gifted, all of that. And all of a sudden you feel useless. You can't do anything. But one of the most painful things I think for me was realizing the damage when I first got sick, my children were 1, 3, and 4 years old, and I basically abandoned them. They all have their own complex trauma because of my 7 years of being very ill, and struggled with depression, anxiety, and it was just dark time. And my kids basically lost their dad for that period of time, and I couldn't just shake myself out of that and pull up my socks and all the things I was told I should do, and it was sorry, just not possible. But I think to me it's almost like that snowball rolling downhill. It's compounding and growing in the damage it's doing, and you feel almost powerless at times to stop it,
Yeah.
because you just can't pull yourself up by your socks. It's like there's something more going on here that I don't even understand, and I don't know what to do about. To me, those dark years, what you talked about, is it's very easy to become self-absorbed and introspective. And I think what I realized about my time is I became very much, my first go-to response in almost any situation was, how can I avoid this? Because I don't have the energy to deal with it and the desire to deal with it. So just this whole avoidant approach to life. And I just would like to go away and find a hole I can crawl into and curl up there. But it was my wife and kids that kept me somewhat engaged,
Yeah.
even though everything in me wanted to avoid. That love piece said, no, I got to be there at least a little bit, until I was able to be there more and more in their lives again. But that, again, that social relationship fabric is such a key piece in us getting back to a healthy place, because we can't pull through just all alone. It's just impossible. Anyways, like, to me, there's so many different layers here that you're touching on that are so important to just highlight, because it's part of it. These are pieces that everybody in recovery is going to have to deal with and become aware of. And so you've walked the road, and you've been able to put it into words, which is fantastic. So take us kind of, you went through that first one, you went through suicidal, losing motivation, then you started getting motivation again, but then you had second brain injury. Then what happened?
Yeah. So I got back to full duties, and the only limitation was I didn't work overnights. So I worked up till about 10 or 11 at night. I didn't work overnights. My doctor said, I'll let you go back to full duties, but you got to get your sleep still. And shift work isn't good for somebody with a brain injury. It isn't good for somebody with a healthy brain. But so I got back to duties, and then in 2013, almost 5 years to the day of the first accident, not too far off at least. We got a call to sort of a fight in progress between roommates. We got on the scene. One guy was sober. The other guy had come home drunk and high and started a fight for no reason, was violent. Took us a long time to break it up. The guy was very violent, quite a big, strong guy too. We finally got him handcuffed, got him to the hospital because he had to get stitches because he had received an injury from the fight with his roommate. Got into the hospital, and he finally kind of calmed down. And when he calmed down with the staff, I let my guard down for a second. I took my hands off the back of his cuffs where I was securing him, and he basically headbutted me to the point where he threw his whole body and weight into the headbutt. Hit me in the head. I was out on my feet, and then the secondary hit off the tile floor in the ER of the hospital. Ironically, good spot, I guess, if you're gonna get the shit beat out of you. And and so I was immediately put on a gurney, and it was like, here we go again. We found out afterwards with all the imaging and everything, it was classified as a moderate traumatic brain injury. I have permanent frontal lobe damage as a result of that injury. I slept for about 2 or 3 months after that injury. Same kind of thing, just can't stay awake. I don't know, any of your listeners have had a brain injury. It's not like you lack motivation to stay awake. It's literally like you would wake up and be awake for an hour and just feel like your eyes slamming shut. It's that level of fatigue. I slept for 2 months, and then this is the interesting part of the story in retrospect. Then I went back to work because I was scared I was going to lose my job because we were in the middle of being taken over by the OPP. So knowing what I know now, going back to work at that point seems I'm not sure how I did it. Like I was falling over, severe problems with memory and attention, migraines 4 or 5 days a week, all the emotional regulation stuff, memory issues, severe. I mean, I went back to work and I would go to calls, and on the way to the lights and siren call to, gun call or something serious, I'd forget where I was going. And when I got to the call, looking for a cue to sort of trigger my memory, and sometimes it wouldn't trigger anything. So I was a danger to myself. I was a danger to others. But at the time, I didn't have the insight or the healthy brain to tell me that I shouldn't be there. Eventually I was diagnosed in that period of time with bipolar, and I was prescribed a bunch of psychiatric meds, and I was also prescribed a small amount of codeine to deal with the almost daily migraines. And so that led into the addiction piece of my story, as well as the bipolar treatment part of my story.
And that to me is like a fourth piece is that mental health component, that bipolar. Do they think that came out of the brain injury?
Yeah, yeah, it's exactly. So basically, it's bipolar, type 2 bipolar, secondary
Okay.
to a frontal lobe brain injury.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so like that's usually fairly heavy medications that kind of mess up emotional stuff even more for people. And then you did some electroshock therapy as part of that as well, which can have horrendous ramifications as well for people. Was that like a 10-year stretch that messed you up?
So the accident was in 2013,
Okay.
and basically, I got clean off of opiates in 2016.
So 3 years.
Yeah, and then got clean off of all the psychiatric meds, probably over the next 6 months or a year after that. Yeah,
Okay.
which was could have been potentially, the psychiatric intervention was probably more damaging than the
Yeah.
opiate addiction in some ways. I mean,
Yeah.
they were waking me up with Concerta, methylphenidate, and then giving me two different antidepressants, an anxiolytic like lorazepam, 600 mgs of Seroquel, slow and fast release, plus 25 milligrams of Seroquel as needed for anxiety, up to 8 times a day on top of that, plus sleep medication. I mean, it was 8 different meds.
Yeah.
And in a sense, the opiate addiction in part came from it actually worked against what the psychiatric meds were doing, gave me some energy and some positive mood, ironically.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I've worked with many clients that similar type of medication mixes as you, and just working with them and the frustration and the downside of it is really, really difficult. Um, do you still struggle with some mental health, bipolar depression type of things, or is that pretty much behind you?
So, yeah. So, just as a sort of a prologue to answer that question. So, if somebody is diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, which means, generally speaking, their lifestyle has created the disease, generally overweight, inactive for the most part. I know there's exceptions. So, the solution to type 2 diabetes that the doctor will give you is usually like metformin, maybe insulin, depends on, something like that, right? But just because um, something works, just because you have a solution, does not mean it's the best solution. You already knew
Yeah.
what I was going to say there, right, Tim?
Yeah.
So, so for me, what I learned to do was, so do I struggle today with mental health issues? The only sort of remnants from the brain injury, the mental health is I occasionally fall over still. That's the head injury thing. I have a bad spatial awareness. That's from the brain injury too. And there are elements of bipolar that creep in where my brain will, for a couple of days go through, I guess you call it hypomanic, where it's rapid thinking. Um, but that's it. So I've managed it. And what I've done is I found solutions, non-medical interventions on myself, and I've learned how to dose myself, and I've overcome bipolar as a result of doing healthy things in a very strict and disciplined manner. I don't have much wiggle room, but I figured out my dosing through a series of healthy protocols that I do every single day without exception, such that I don't require meds. And other than that odd sort of uh, speedy thinking, sort of that little bit of that hypomanic thinking type stuff. Other than that, I'm drug free, pharmaceutical free.
And I would be similar. So I went through like deep depression, anxiety, and a wee bit of almost bipolar 2. And it was really getting myself physically healthy, and all the things you're talking about, that kind of, you got to dose yourself with certain behaviors and activities and routines and commitments and all of that. I still, this time of year when we're moving from summer to winter and the light's getting less and less, I still feel a little bit of depression nipping at my heels, but I've lived with it long enough. I know kind of what to do to manage it and be, not go down that road like I would have in the past. And I think that's significant. So I never want people to see medication as bad, but because the people that want to do that have been in situations where the medication was actually given to them in a way that was abuse almost. And so to them it was bad. But medication does have its place. But I think the Western medical model is we put too much into medication. And there's so many other tools that we can use to heal ourselves and to be healthy that don't require medication. And it's learning to kind of discover those, which is what you're talking about. So thank you for that.
I have the same sort of perspective on medication. And I suspect, I'm always hedging my bets with everything I say because I never pretend to know everything and I'm open to being wrong. But I suspect that part of the problem that we run into when someone goes to the doctor for meds for depression, anxiety, secondary to some trauma, or whatever it is, when a doctor gives you an antidepressant or an anxiolytic, the messaging is that you have a neurotransmitter problem. That's what drugs do. So, we talked earlier and used that word that I love, which is agency. Right away, by the time they get into my office, they've already been to their doctor and they're on something like that. So the doctor's told them you have a neurochemical problem. So the sense of agency isn't there. It's like, no, I've got this thing called depression, or I've got this thing called anxiety, you see, and I even got the script for it. It's like, so we're kind of working against that, aren't we? It's like,
exactly.
Yeah.
And to me, it's part of, again, the Western model is the doctor's the professional, we're the dummy. So we outsource the locus of control to an external person. They're going to fix us. They're going to tell us what to do.
Yeah.
We're compliant and we'll do what we're told, and then we'll be. And when it comes to the area of trauma and a lot of mental health stuff, it's that we can't outsource that. We need input from others, but we got to get this locus of control to be internal. And what can I do to develop a healthier life? And that, to me, is so essential, especially with people with trauma and learned helplessness, is you still come into recovery wanting to outsource your recovery to a counselor, to a program, to a church, whatever. And it's like, no, you got to take responsibility for your own recovery. And you're going to need a lot of help, but you got to make the decisions and have the agency to do that. So, okay, before we go on, I just wanted to see if Andy wanted to jump in because he usually has some good questions.
I don't know. I mean, you've gone in so many different directions here that I think I've got probably 3 hours of information that I want to peel out of the two of you at this point. And I found this has been really topical for me, like for this year. It's not a New Year's resolution, but like my goal for this year has been my own agency, assertiveness, boundaries, courage, and compassion work. And so your story and this conversation has really resonated with that. And so I do have a few questions kind of in that realm, but the first one that I'd like to ask is, kind of you've talked a lot about this kind of this high functioning, speedy brain, And then all of a sudden, with the TBIs, like there's this like change. Like, how did it affect your sense of identity? Was there a lot of shame around that? And kind of maybe how have you recreated a sense of identity
Yeah.
today? Like, how do you look at yourself now?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's interesting because uh, in terms of the intelligence piece and my identity as being sort of gifted or intelligent, and I've always had an awareness of that. Um, After the first injury, because my brain was so compromised, I felt so slow and stupid. I did suffer with this sort of existential, like who am I? Like normally I'm, and it's funny. Well, I find it funny. It's funny. So the first neuropsych testing that they did after that initial injury was a couple of months after, and they identified some deficits, obviously. And part of the neuropsych testing, they gave a full Wechsler adult intelligence scale, and then a bunch of memory subscales. And I'm sure you're aware of those things. And so after the first set of tests, my IQ was 129, which doesn't mean a lot, but it's not 130. And 130 would have meant I could have applied and got into Mensa and given myself the message that no, I'm still smart, Hal. And that was really important to me. Oddly enough, of all the things to worry about, it was my IQ score and could I apply and be a Mensa member. And so I didn't know what I was doing back then, but that's what I was doing. I was trying to get back to my sense of self that, hey, I'm a smart guy. There's some interesting IQ stuff that happened after the second injury, which are kind of interesting. I guess I mentioned it quickly, but after the second injury, my IQ was 142, and about I don't know, 5 years later, when I was going to go to university, I had to get my IQ tested again through the same agency, and it was 152. So, I always joke like I'm one more car accident, head injury away from being some kind of super genius. Like, what's it going to go to next? But yeah, my sense of self, my identity as a provider, as a husband, as a police officer. Um, I mean, I think that's part of the suicidality that evolved. Like, you want to hurt somebody, compromise their sense of self, their dignity, their ability to exercise agency in their life, their sense of purpose, which mine was, as we derived or I explained earlier, from my mother, of serving others and contributing, and from my father, from learning and growing. I couldn't do either. So who am I? And if I'm not contributing, then I'm nothing. And I've had to do my inner work around that now, because there will be a day and time when I won't be able to contribute like I used to. I don't know if that answered your question, Andy, but
Mm, mhm. Yeah, I feel there's like another piece here too, kind of with the addiction coming on, like knowing that you were a police officer at the time. Um, you know, what do you wish that people could like understand about like how that dependency can come into place, even with somebody like you who was super disciplined, high functioning, and also like working in a job that probably looks down upon it more than other.
yeah, yeah. You want to talk about shame, right? Here I am, still there. Yeah,
Mhm.
which I'm okay with. I think if I think most therapists, if they saw what I just sort of like come out there with the shame and guilt, they would say, let's work through that. I'm like, no, fuck that. I don't want to get rid of it. I'm going to hold on to it. Thank you very much, because I don't want to rewrite history that I didn't hurt others. I don't want to rewrite history that my addiction was less than devastating to people around me and myself. Because if I rewrite history, then there's the opportunity in the future that if I minimize this, maybe I can head back towards it. And so that's the darkness. And I own that shame and guilt. And I don't focus on it, so it doesn't hurt me anymore. But when I do think about it, it keeps me moving towards the light. And so there is shame and guilt there. I was a sworn officer to uphold the law, and I wasn't doing it. I was a bad guy. And so it's taken me a long time to work through that and understand, at the same time as still feeling some of that to keep me moving in the right direction towards the light. I also do allow myself a little grace at times. And the grace is I don't focus on it for a long period of time because it doesn't serve me anymore.
Just if I can say a couple of things to that, Hal, because I think what I've seen for people that end up um, with trauma and then make a bunch of coping decisions that are bad decisions that do a lot of damage to themselves and others, this guilt piece is huge for them to work through. And what I want them to realize is, kind of given where you're at and the tools you had, you chose to respond this way, and now you feel legitimate guilt, not just for the damage you did yourself, but what you did to others. And you never want to lose, like you say, never want to lose the pain
Yeah.
piece that caused and the damage that it did, because that's a powerful motivator. But the forgiveness piece to me is not minimizing it. The forgiveness piece is, I'm not going to beat myself up anymore, and try to keep punishing myself. I'm actually going to now switch this and go, let's turn this into a positive. How can I help others? Let's use this as a platform to help others who are struggling with the same issue. But I'm glad you're talking about this, because a lot of people, there's so much bad teaching around self-forgiveness
Yeah.
that they think, I got to keep the pain alive, which is fine, but to them that means I have to beat myself up and keep saying I don't deserve success, I don't deserve good stuff. And no. So then, well, forgive yourself means act like it was no big deal. No.
Yeah.
It's finding that healthy distinction between the pain is always going to be there, the regrets are always going to be there, and that's a good thing, but I don't have to feed them. I don't have to go down that old rabbit hole of beating myself up and seeing myself as a failure. I can turn this into a positive that helps others, which is what you've done. But why I'm highlighting this is because in my experience, this is an issue for so many people that trips them up in their recovery, and they just can't find a way to get it resolved in a healthy way. They just keep going back to old ways of dealing with guilt that keep messing them up. So thank you for kind of sharing your path through that.
Yeah, and I had a comment there that this connects back to a few of the things we've already touched on, which is when people get stuck in the victim role or mentality, they're not able to move forward. And so,
Correct.
so staying stuck in the shame and guilt and really focusing on it and beating the shit out of yourself is just a self-inflicted victimization. It's
Exactly.
not that someone else did something to me. It's I'm continuing to victimize myself. And so I think you're right. There's this like middle ground we have to find with our clients as well, where they're not spending a lot of time focused on the bad things and telling themselves, how bad they are. They need to accept that they made mistakes and that if they could have come from a higher place, they would have.
Exactly.
And I never ask my clients who are in addiction and they're in their recovery. I never ask them, why did you use drugs? I always ask them, why were you in so much pain?
Exactly.
you know
Exactly.
and
Yeah.
because it's never been a mystery to me why people struggle with drugs and alcohol. It's been a mystery to me as an opiate addict in recovery. It's a mystery why everybody doesn't use it for me.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And so again, to me, a couple things that are just beautiful from that, and that is really helping people to begin to reframe failure. Because for many people growing up complex trauma, failure was never a good thing. Failure only led to being punished, more pain. And so if they had a fear of failure, failure was to be avoided. Failure meant you are a failure. And so now, as they look at those things in their life where they failed, they just, well, are you going to punish me? They can't show compassion to themselves. They got to punish themselves. And so to me, it becomes such an important thing for those people to begin to be able to go, failure is not the end of the world, doesn't mean I am a failure. I failed. I accept that. Everybody fails, but I can grow from this. And so there's that acceptance piece. And then the second thing mention that I think is an issue for many people. So many people coming out of complex trauma, part of their trauma in their household growing up was a lack of justice. And you'll relate, especially as a police officer. And so when they fail, okay, the crime's been committed. Now justice has to be served. So they
Right.
need jail time. So I failed. Now, how much jail time do I need to pay off this crime that I've committed to satisfy justice? Well, in their mind, it's I need to be in the doghouse for a month. I need to
Right.
beat myself up for a month to pay the crime. And so it's really realizing that justice isn't just punitive, that justice is, I'm going to turn this into learning and helping others and making less of this in the world. So again, it's a reframing of so many different things to help people get through this
Yeah.
guilt failure piece that's so important.
Yeah, I mean, and you articulated that so beautifully, and it's this idea of failure comes up a lot, clinically, and I've really, I think, probably similar to some of what you expressed there. I really try to turn a 180 on it, like, and we're sort of we absorb that failure is bad at a young age, right? And so I really try to help my clients reframe failure as an indication of activity. And I think a lot of it comes from, well, these days, some of it comes from like social media and the internet. It's like we look at these successful people, and some of them, let's say they are successful with fitness or whatever, business, whatever, and we tend to think that they were lucky, had good genetics, had it easy. So in public they're successful. What we didn't see in private was that the path to success in any area of life is the same for everybody. Failure, 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 get back on the saddle, recalibrate our direction, fail, fail, fail. So I try to encourage my clients to see failure as an indication of activity and life, as opposed to
Exactly.
being a negative. So when a client talks about failure, I don't jump in and say, oh no, that wasn't a failure. I'm like, yeah, good. The only way to guarantee that we don't experience failure is to sit still on the couch under the blankets, but that's failure in a different way, and that's
Exactly.
hiding in the cave because you realize there's dragons and monsters afoot. And the
Exactly.
monsters may not find you in the form of like failure if you don't go out, but they'll find you in other ways like depression, anxiety, meaninglessness, purposelessness, and those kinds of things. So we help our clients realize, it's better to leave the cave and quote unquote fail, because you're failing forward then, which is
Exactly.
very different than failing backward, like you and I were, in the depression and mental health issues we had with depression, right? Pull the blankets over our head, and we were failing on our heels in a sense.
Yeah, and I think like both your story and my story, it's now being coined as post-traumatic growth.
Yeah.
That you don't just heal from trauma, you actually grow to a level you never would have had if you didn't have the trauma. Um, and that's to me the beauty of it. There's a ton of work in there
Yeah.
in the healing and the growing process, but if you do that work, you come out the other side in a place that you never imagined you ever could have been at. So anyways, back to Andy. I don't want to cut you off from asking your
I
question.
don't know. Well, there's a couple of other directions that open up, but one that I do want to go, and especially as you're talking about reframing, like I've noticed here that you have what I'd call as an easy access to vulnerability, and I would just love to know, our society talks about masculinity, toxic masculinity, and so coming from having been a black belt and a police officer, have you always had this easy access to vulnerability, and kind of what's the frame that you look at that vulnerability right now to showcase a healthy masculinity?
uh Man, I feel like I could talk with you two all day. I mean, every time that you folks, either one of you say something, my mind splinters in 8 different directions where we could talk probably for, I mean, it's been a beautiful conversation. So thank you both. So yeah, the vulnerability piece is, I, you know, it feels like there's not a lot of good male role models out there right now. We're talking about masculinity. It feels that way. It's like there's maybe like someone who's maybe like overly effeminate, sort of maybe gentle, passive, which is wonderful and beautiful. Is someone who's in touch with their emotions and can express them. And then there's the what you see in the first responder policing community more often than not, the hyper masculine, aggressive, sort of seemingly but not actually stoic front. And it's like, so young men these days, it's like is like pick a lane. And so it's interesting in my practice, you would bring this up, is that, I work with a lot of young men and a lot of men in general, and I'm talking about this very thing all the time. And my message is, um, and I think what I model is that you can be both, that you can have the potential for, aggression, and even these things aren't usually required, but to have the masculine energy of aggression, and even if cornered, violence, albeit that's the last resort, of course. But you can have strength, and at the same time, you can be in touch with your emotions, and you can be a poet warrior. You can be both. You don't have to pick a lane. And I think that's the ultimate expression of masculinity, is to be a provider, a protector, a role model, and at the same time, be a man who realizes that the ultimate courage is absolute vulnerability, not invulnerability. Because the word courage, when we're talking about masculinity, courage comes along in the conversation. That word comes from the root cur, which means heart, which means to tell one's story with one's full heart. In other words, to be vulnerable. And this is what I aspire to in my life, what I try to model for my sons and even my clients, is that when you have the freedom where you no longer are concerned with someone seeing you, really seeing you cry, whatever. I'm on a big podcast here and I've cried a few times. It's like when you have that courage, like what's left to be scared of? What is left? People can really see me, and I'm not scared of what they might think or do with that information. It's very freeing, and I think that's what ultimate masculinity is. Just the best guess, though.
If I can just jump in, Andy, again. um, like two things that I wanted to say is many people coming out of complex trauma, the first thing they had to kind of murder in themselves was authenticity.
Yeah.
Because if they were authentic and vulnerable, they got punished, they got rejected, they got abandoned, they got tried to be pushed into different molds. And so they had to learn to fawn, be chameleons, all of that in order to survive. But then the second thing is, especially for boys, is their definition of strength was very distorted. And so the definition of strength was repressing emotions, repressing conscience, repressing love, empathy, because crying, all of those make you weak. All of those make you, and so strong is basically you got to murder parts of yourself that make you human. And so strength is being less human, basically, which is what soldiers have to become and all of that to survive. It's survival mode, living. And so to me, it's what you're saying is just so beautiful. True strength is pure authenticity. I don't care how you respond. I'm okay with me, and I don't have to hide anything. I don't have to adapt in order to please you. I can be me, and not every man's going to be the same because we're all different. And so your emotional life is going to be a little different than mine, and that's okay. Your engagement in sports is going to be different than mine, and that's okay. You might be more interested in the arts, and I just love football. Like, that's fine. We're both men. But the key, the heart, is not the externals. The heart is, am I my authentic self that I can put on display? And what I want people from trauma to realize is you need safe people in your life in order to be able to do that. As long as you have the unsafe people, you got to go back to protecting that little child in you from being judged and criticized and rejected again. So you need that community of safe people where you can learn to be authentic, and then the healing really begins.
Oh man, man, yes, yes. Everything you're saying resonates at such a high level with me, and the way you articulate it is so beautiful too, Tim. Thank you. What's interesting, to connect a few dots here in our conversation, is what's really interesting is that the context in which trauma occurs determines whether the outcome in terms of PTSD or lifelong issues. What's really interesting in the first responder world is what we know. Um, if you look at the sort of the anthropological record, the historical record, what we see is that when men have to do warrior type things across time, from the Spartans right up to today, the context in which those traumas were experienced by men determines whether PTSD was existent or not. In warrior cultures like the Spartans, when they return from war, we're going to talk about authenticity, the ability to express yourself freely. When they return from war, they were literally encircled by their community. They were cheered. They were allowed to wail, cry, scream for the loss of their, fellow tribesmen, for having to have killed somebody. And while they were completely authentic in the expression of what they had witnessed, they are encircled and supported by the community. The next day, there's no PTSD.
Right.
Same thing when you look at maybe as the counter to that, the Vietnam War, when warriors came back from having to have done some awful and dare witnessed awful things, they were spit on. When
Yeah.
you look at PTSD rates, it's very clear, and you could look at this from childhood stuff as well. It's like, it's the context. Are we allowed to be authentic? Are we supported by other genuine, authentic individuals? If we are, then the aftermath is not nearly what it is if we're unsupported.
Exactly. And that's where Peter Levine talks about the Portuguese word for, well, they have three words for trauma, but one of them is it's a break in the fabric of society that doesn't support people properly
Wow.
through their struggles. And so it's a community issue, not just a personal issue. And yeah.
I want to touch back on that. I love your use of the word courage, because that's one that I go to a lot. And Tim in his Lift program, he'll say tough love several times, and it always triggers me because I know what Tim means when he says tough love. But everybody else I've ever heard use the word tough love is they're bullying you, and there's no love behind it. And I've found, when you talk about that courage and that authenticity, there's this marrying back together in that word courage of that openness and that vulnerability. And to me, like, courage is the full definition of the word love, where you can be that open, that vulnerability, unafraid to cry in front of somebody, unafraid to show your emotions, to have the strength to walk through that. And so I really love that. And what I'd love to ask is, you were both talking about the learned helplessness. What are some of these kind of initial baby steps, or the ways to look at yourself or to look at your life, to begin to take these steps to shifting from a place of learned helplessness to a place where you have more agency and more courage?
Yeah. Maybe I'll share how I shifted from that in, sort of 2016, how I get out of that. Basically, my addiction ended. My rock bottom wasn't death or jail. It, it was using my best friend's pain medication after surgery. So I'm very lucky in that my rock bottom wasn't a lot worse than it could have been. And so in that moment in time, I decided to get clean. And I also decided to take agency in my own life. Now, what I did, in which we kind of do with clients in one way, shape, or form, is I literally sat down at my kitchen table with a pen and paper. And I asked myself the question, if my job, if my project, if my task was to create a man that was strong, flexible, had endurance, was emotionally sound and grounded in peace, was patient, was at an elite level of health, because the higher energy you have, the more you can give to others and the better life you have. That's tied 100% to our health. If my job is to create that man, what would I put him through in a day? And I knew sure as hell it wasn't sitting on the couch eating Doritos, watching Netflix. And so I made a list. I made a list. I think it started with maybe 10 things. And I said to myself, I'm going to do these things every single day for 90 days and see what happens. I get nothing to lose. And a man who has nothing to lose is dangerous. In terms of how I was at that point, I had nothing to lose. I put the habits on the fridge, and then I wrote out 4 life principles. And again, it was, if my job was to create a man who led the best life, not just for himself, but a man, my vision was for this man was, I was trying to create a man who, when tragedy strikes, parents, deathbed, kids get sick, bankruptcy, whatever tragedy or awful situation, this is the man who not only can weather that storm, but this is a man who everyone else leans on during the storm. That's what I decided. This is the project. And I wrote out 4 life principles. And for 90 days, I said, I'm going to live by these 4 principles. I'm going to do every single thing on this list of habits and rituals. And I'm going to try to become this vision of a man. And I slowly and incrementally, because it's never a straight up shot, slowly and incrementally over those months and then over the last number of years, had developed a series of daily rituals that I do every single day, and dose myself with the chemicals and challenge myself with some really, really hard things physically. And you guys would already know what's on the list. It's everything that you would think would be on the list, including really pushing myself into some extreme environments, both heat, cold, running, fasting, all those things. And all those, and so that's how I slowly, incrementally get out of learned helplessness and became the hero in my own story, such that when we have gone through personal tragedies, we've had some, some bad things happen in our family. We lost an aunt and uncle to a head-on collision in a motorcycle. We lost our my wife's father a couple of years ago in a car accident. We were in hospital with him for 6 weeks before he passed. We've gone through lots of stuff that happens in life. And those for me are opportunities. Those are audits for me. Am I still engaged in the project? Am I still doing the daily things that allow me to be that man that everyone else leans on? And life is constantly giving me audits, and I'm constantly tweaking and adding in and refining these sets of processes. But so far, so good.
Just 2 comments, because again, to me, that beautiful stuff. So the first would be, I've dealt with so many people that have done that. They've made a list and they've done it for 90 days and they go, oh, I'm feeling good. Okay, good. I'm fixed.
Yeah.
And they don't quite get that you got to do this for the rest of your life. This becomes your daily routine, who you are. And so I'm so glad you mentioned that. And to me, what I hope people find is, yes, you're going to go through times where those routines feel a bit like drudgery, but they ultimately really become sources of joy. You enjoy doing them. There's almost something therapeutic as you do it more and more, that you want to do them. It's not you have to do them, you want to do them, but you're glad you have the days where you forced yourself to do them until they became part of habits, etc. So to me, the second thing is this. Over the years, I've found people, to answer Andy's question and agency, there's kind of that, some people first need some information, education, self-awareness, lots of learning. That's the starting point of their recovery. Others need to do some therapeutic, healing the trauma, emotional stuff. That becomes the breakthrough in starting their recovery. But I would say, regardless, everybody's got to start with some action stuff. That you just got to change your lifestyle, the tools you use, your daily practices, your habits. And so ideally, you're blending activity with learning with therapy as the 3 kind of pieces. But then the fourth piece to me that so many don't get is you also have to create connection with healthy people, because you can't just do emotional thinking and action in isolation and expect to get very far. You got to have connection. But a lot of people coming out of complex trauma, the way they survived was to escape to their head and become academic. So when they come into recovery, it's just like, teach me, show me what everything is, help me understand everything. It's like, no, you got to get out of that helplessness and learn to act. And that becomes for them the most critical and difficult piece in their beginning their recovery journey. So
can I add one quick thing there, which is, again, you articulated that so well, and it's, the social and connection piece. I learned the value of that through, in my recovery, partly through NA, but I learned it from an elderly woman. And so we were at a get together, kind of a party of sorts, and I met this older lady. She was, I think, in her late 70s when I met her, and I got chatting with her just about my life and her life. And I don't know if you've had this moment in a conversation. I kind of suddenly realized, oh wow, this is a real conversation. Like, this isn't like a superficial. Like, she was deeply listening to. Like, she was. You know when someone looking in your eyes, like they're there, which oddly enough, that's rare. And so we were having this conversation, and she was telling me about her life, and she was saying that her husband had died a year earlier to when I met her. And she said that her husband had been abusive to her in every way. They were married for 50 plus years, and he had isolated her. He had sexually and physically abused her and financially abused her. But she said the worst thing he did to her was isolate her socially. So when he died a year previous to me meeting her, she said that she made a decision on that day that she was going to connect in a real authentic level with everyone and anyone she met. She said she didn't care if it was the checkout person at Walmart or a stranger on the street or someone like me that she met at a get together. And she called it sparking.
right.
And she said, I'm going to spark with everyone I meet. And she talked about that. And I was listening to her, and I said, well, like, what difference will it make, you think, when you whether you spark or not? And she said, when I get to the end of my life and I look back with all those little sparks, surely my life will be one filled with light. It was one of the most beautiful things I'd ever heard. And that story has stuck with me. This is many years ago. And to this day, even my kids or my wife would say that that's what I do, whether it's with the Walmart checkout person or someone on the sidewalk, or you two here today, is to try and be authentic and deeply connect, because it's those little sparks, it's the light that ultimately is where the truest and the strongest healing occurs, whether
Exactly.
it's trauma, addiction, or anything else.
And if I can just build off that, to me, what comes out of complex trauma is the child's trying to connect and they can't. And so they assume that they're the problem. So they go to the next step, which is then I don't even want to connect with myself. So they disconnect from self and they can't connect with others. So they have a life of dissociation and disconnection. But they don't really see the problem of that till they get married and have kids. And then they realize they have trouble being present to anybody. So they're in the room, but they're not really 100% concentrating, giving attention and focus to their children, etc. And they begin to see the damage that it's doing to their kids. Their kids feel that they're not worthy of my time, or they don't matter to me. And so to me, a huge part of healing for people is learning to be present in the present to themselves, present to others, which is that sparking. So everybody I meet, I want to be fully present to. And that says more to a person that I respect you than anything else that you can do for a person. So thank you for that. Okay, Andy, back to you.
I have so many, two things.
I think
One is
we're going to need another podcast here.
Yeah.
As I think the
We'll have to
obvious
do more.
conclusion.
Yeah. Well, I think what you'll identify from my questions is like what I try to elicit out of you is I want to be able to provide a compass for somebody who might be listening to something that they could latch on to, or something that they could understand, that may just give like a subtle mindset shift to understand something in a different way. And so with that, like I do have like two more questions. And so thinking about the spark and thinking about the connecting, um, I know you've talked in the past about kind of walking into a 12-step meeting and originally, having this like better than attitude.
Mm.
Um, and I was wondering, but you've also talked about kind of shifting more to this, to that connecting attitude of recognizing that you belong here. And so I was wondering if that's something that you maybe somatically, psychologically, attitudinally, like how do those two different methods of looking at other people, being with other people, like how does it look? How does it feel? Like how do you make that shift? What does that shift feel like to move from this disconnected state to one of more of belonging and connection?
Man, that's a really big question. And yeah, I won't have time to give a big answer, but I'll give a short one. Um, I mean, what we're really talking about here, if we really sort of strip away the layers, if you will, it is we're talking about love, aren't we? One of the principles I wrote down when I sat down that day years ago to decide how I wanted to live my life was more love, less judgment. And so you can see how the two parts of that sentence can lead to more connection and more belonging and less judging of others as better than or worse than or anything like that. And, I learned that through an experience I had after my second injury where I was part of a healing circle, and that's where that principle came out of. It's not an original principle. Nothing on that habit list I'm referring to, nothing on the written principles I had are original. Some of these ideas I've had across time I thought were original, but I've Googled them all. I don't have an original thought. Most of it goes back to the Stoics. So, but what happened was I was invited to a healing circle as a victim of that incident from the hospital I mentioned. And I'm not sure if you're aware of a healing circle is, but basically it's a way where we try to circumvent the court system and deal with matters, criminal matters, in a way where there doesn't necessarily have to be a trial or jail time. Generally speaking, healing circles or community justice forums, they're called in Ontario, they come from Aboriginal roots culture. I usually they're for less serious crimes often, but this was a pretty serious assault on a police officer, so it was a serious one. But I was approached about doing it by the Crown, and so I said I would. So I went to this healing circle. You're supposed to bring your support system, anyone and everyone you want to come to this meeting. I went by myself because my wife was too angry, to be honest, with the guy who had hurt me. Um, Fair enough, she was injured at that time too by what had happened, and was very scared about my future to ever work again because the prognosis was not good and the impact on our kids. So I went, and the gentleman who had assaulted me came, and he brought a whole bunch of people, um, friends, family, support, maybe a pastor. I don't know. There are a bunch of people on the other side of the circle. So I'm on one side, they're kind of on the other. And the way these things flow is you share your part of the story, what happened, impact, then they share theirs, and then it can be court agreed upon conditions that can come out of that. So there's a court liaison there. And so I shared my story, and I'm staring at the ground because I can't look at this guy because I hadn't seen him since the incident. And it's really easy to judge other people with distance. And this is why healing circles work, is because now you are closer to the person and they're human, and you can't keep them in the silo of evil, bad, awful. And so I'm sharing my story, and I'm staring at the ground, and suddenly in part of my story, I hear there's kind of a noise near the side of the room, a bit of a disturbance, and it kind of grows and spreads to the point where I kind of come out of my sort of stare and look up, and he's sobbing. Just, but not just him. Everyone on the other side of the room is sobbing when they're hearing the details of what had happened to me and the impact of my kids and my future and my health. And you want to talk about change. Change is often like a dimmer switch, but sometimes in life it's not. And I stood up and I crossed the room and I told him to stand up, and I'm pretty sure he thought I was going to break his nose, but I didn't. I gave him a hug and I said, "I forgive you." I said, The only thing you owe me going forward is show someone else a little more love and a little less judgment someday in your own life. And so I think that taught me something about not judging others. That taught me something about the power of connection. And so, as you can hear, a lot of these things, the wisdom that I've attained, most of it has not come from books. And most of what I share with my clients in therapy, a tiny, tiny bit comes from books. Most of it comes from these lived experiences. I've been so lucky to have had to go through these painful, tragic, awful situations, because only having gone through that, I've become the man that I've talked about wanting to become, not despite everything you've heard in my story. I've become that man because of it.
I think this has been absolutely fantastic, and it's going to be both instructional but at an academic but very practical way for our listeners.
Yeah. And so I'll have kind of maybe two final words coming from you, Hal. And so just the first one is, if there's somebody listening today that's in that place, living with trauma, what's one simple practice that maybe they could start today to begin reconnecting to their mind and to their body?
Yeah. Well, I guess the simplest but not easiest thing I would say is what we know now from the research. It's quite clear is that um, whether you're dealing with trauma or the subsequent depression or anxiety, what we know is one of the simplest and most effective things that we can do. And I often tell my clients this. I'll often say, "We've been talking for 50 minutes. You would have been better off to go for a jog around the building for 50 minutes than talk to me." Exercise, what we know now, is the number one thing we can do often to start to heal. There's a lot of reasons for it. Many of them are physiological, but perhaps most importantly, what it is people that have experienced complex trauma often struggle with self-esteem and their sense of self and their value. One of the ways that we reestablish that is if we can get them to engage in behaviors that provide them evidence that they are of value. Through treating yourself well and going for a walk in the woods, eating a healthy meal, you are giving yourself and creating an evidence file, starting to at the very least, that I must love myself. I must be worthy of care because I'm doing the number one thing that is a reflection of that, which is taking care of this system here. Hope that answered your question.
Yeah, it's a beautiful reflection. And Hal, where can people find you and your work online?
So, I mean, if you just Google Hal Hughes, you'll find my website at halhughes.com, and I'm pretty easy to find online. Yeah.
What I'd just like to wrap up and say, as far as people accessing Hal, is, to me, there's right now almost a crisis situation in our first responders, police force, as far as secondary trauma. And there's resources that we're beginning to realize need to be provided to firefighters and ambulance and police and all of that. And I think how that's really what you're wanting to kind of lead the way and really flourish. And I just want people to know that if they are a first responder or in a relationship with a first responder, feel free to reach out because help is available. And it's a whole new way of living life. That's part of it, but it's also dealing with some deep trauma stuff. That's also part of it. So thank you for being here, Hal.
Thanks for having me.
And Hal, thanks for being with us here today, for your honesty, your wisdom, and your wide open heart. And for everybody who's listening, I hope that something Hal shared today reminds you that courage isn't the absence of fear or vulnerability, but it's this choice to keep showing up one day at a time. And as always, take care of yourselves, and we'll see you next time. Thank you for joining us on the Time with Tim podcast. If you'd like to share your own experiences or have questions, feel free to email us at podcasts@timfletcher.ca. Want to learn more about complex trauma? Subscribe to Tim Fletcher's YouTube channel for past lectures and his Friday night Tim Talks. You can also connect with us on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, and TikTok. Looking for more support? We offer programs and courses to help with healing complex trauma and recovering from addictions. Visit timfletcher.ca to learn more or send us an inquiry. We're here to support you. Until we meet again, take care and thank you for letting us be a part of your healing journey.